Morning, everyone. My name is Will Pomerantz, and I'd like to welcome you to today's discussion with our current George F. Kennan Scholar, Andrew Monaghan. As always, we encourage you to stay up to date on the latest Kennan Institute events and publications by subscribing to our two blogs, Focus Ukraine and The Russia File, as well as our podcast, Kennan X and The Russian File. You can also visit our Hindsight Upfront Ukraine collection on our Wilson Center website for the latest news and analysis on Ukraine. Today's book talk has been made possible with the cooperation of Manchester University Press. For attendees today, they have offered a 25% discount on the upcoming book that's going to be discussed, Russian Grand Strategy in the Era of Global Power Competition, as well as other books at the Manchester University Press. You can use the code capital O, capital T, capital H, 882 to receive that discount on the Manchester University website. As usual, we are open for questions during the course of this presentation. You can submit the questions via email to kennan@wilsoncenter.org, via Twitter @Kennan Institute, or on our Facebook page at any time. Please include your name and affiliation when sending questions. Let me begin, though, by introducing Dr. Andrew Monaghan. He is a researcher and analyst in the field of international politics. He founded the Russia Research Network in 2006, and he continues as its director. He also is a non-resident associate fellow at the NATO Defense College, as well as an honorary senior research fellow at the University of Birmingham. He is the author of numerous books on Russian politics, including Dealing with the Russians, Power in Modern Russia, and the New Politics of Russia. Andrew, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Will. Good morning to you, and good morning to you all on the call. I really appreciate the opportunity to be able to present the book and the ideas in the book, both to this wider audience, and of course it's an honor to be able to do so at the Kennan Institute. It gives me an opportunity to say publicly what a pleasure it's been to be a George Kennan Fellow and to work with you and your colleagues at the Institute. And of course, to a degree, given our current situation, for us to ask what George Kennan himself would have made of these times. I'd like to start with a question, if I may, in some senses, how we go about thinking about strategy when we see the appalling tragedy underway in Ukraine and what's in the news. But actually, I think it's rather important to keep strategy in mind as the temperature rises. So I'd like to run these two conversations in some senses alongside each other: the current events, which are not really the focus of my remarks, and then this longer term perspective and question of grand strategy that really we want to try and get at in the book. I don't want to drag you through all the detail in the book. I encourage you to go directly to it. This is an advanced reading copy, but to give you an idea, the book, it seeks to be a multidisciplinary and detailed analysis of Russian grand strategy. So it brings together a number of Russia specialists, but also thematic specialists, particularly important given that there are deep and detailed and significant questions to be asked about both energy and economics. What I'd like to do, instead of taking you through the detail, is present some of the key themes and questions that we tried to examine in this project. And really the core focus then is to attempt to ask the question that's been posed more or less monthly from throughout the 2010s about whether Moscow has a grand strategy or not, a strategic approach, or was it just tactical and acting on an ad hoc and opportunistic basis. So really the book is an attempt to examine why we are where we are, and then therefore give us some sense of trajectory and context for looking ahead perhaps. So these I'll break into three key themes then. First of all, it's one of trajectory. And what we're seeing now is the result of a very serious series of policy and values clashes and disagreements over a 20-year plus period between Moscow on the one hand and the Euro-Atlantic community on the other, whether that's framed as Washington or London or Brussels. We have been speaking in London and the US and in our strategic documents of great power competition since about 2017. In fact, what we're seeing now is this great power competition made real with the war in Ukraine. It's worth pointing out, though, that Moscow came to this conclusion about a decade before we did. We can go right back to President Putin's Munich speech in 2007, but even so, even before that, there was a strong sense of course, of dissonance and disagreement over NATO enlargement and a variety of other political questions, policy questions. But really, once we get to 2007, 2008, we're seeing lots of discussion in Moscow about an emerging geopolitical and especially geoeconomic competition. And within this, what we see is it's made explicit by President Putin, amongst several others of the senior leadership, that this is a competition over, as Putin said, the whiff of oil and gas is behind many current policy démarches. So it's a sense of competition over resources, over transit routes, and over access to markets. This has been restated on numerous occasions ever since in terms of both public policy speeches and in strategic documents, also the strategic documents that Moscow publishes. It's worth pointing out also that, in fact, the military too have subscribed to this sense of geo-economic competition. Both Nikolai Makarov, the former Chief of General Staff, and then Valery Gerasimov, the current Chief of General Staff, both pointed to this sense of competition over resources, the threat to Russia's resources and transit routes, that particularly that the Euro-Atlantic community posed to Russia. So already we start to see a dissonance in views between Moscow and London, Washington, and Brussels. But this sense that geoeconomics lies at the heart of a growing competition and strategic competition is an important one, because in fact this was exactly made explicit by Gerasimov in early 2013 before his now infamous speech and an article allegedly talking about measures short of war. So what we see here is a useful context that, in fact, this geoeconomic competition was also viewed as a military threat. This is quite important for us if we think in the longer term and we try and place Russian policies into their context. First of all, it reminds us that, in fact, much of what the Russian leadership has been talking about over the last decade is not measures short of war, but in fact a concern about measures of war and preparing the state accordingly. How we go about thinking about this then is important. First of all, it's not a new Cold War where we are now. We must think in fresh terms, avoiding sitting in our comfortable mental furniture. We must look not too much to the past, although of course there's significant inheritance here. We must be starting to look to foresight and looking ahead, because this is what the Russian political and military leadership were talking about as a trajectory through into the 2020s. So Gerasimov, Putin, and others are talking about this even in the late 2000s and early 2010s. They're talking about this geoeconomic competition coming through into the 2020s. So it requires foresight on our part to look ahead and think about how we envisage also the 2020s, as well as thinking about how Russia does so as well. And again, therefore, we have this question of trajectory. We can really be looking at Russian strategic planning from around the mid-2000s, perhaps. Initially through to 2020, there was a series of documents produced and strategic agenda documents produced in the mid-2000s with a horizon out to 2020. And since the mid-2010s, we have another horizon put further into the future of 2030 into 2035. All of these documents, whether it's the national security strategy or the foreign policy concept, military doctrine, but also a number of other important strategic texts, point to global shifts and structural change in international affairs. And it's worth bearing in mind here, just as we look at this sense of trajectory, that Russian official and often public think tank foresight envisages a range of scenarios, almost all of which are very pessimistic. And we come to some of this in the book in more depth. This takes me to the second key theme of the book, which is the question of strategy and what it means, and does Moscow have one? What is strategy? Well, strategy is an executive process. It's the formulation of plans based on those assumptions, the foresight assumptions, formulation of plans, and then their implementation. And it's a very useful tool, in fact, for opening up how we understand Russian policy. as an executive process, of course, we also understand that it's a very difficult process. We understand that everyone who has tried strategy throughout history in every state has found it difficult. Where it helps us here is that it draws us not only to the ability to understand the priorities that the Russian leadership sets out in its strategic agenda, but also the shift in landscape that we've seen in Moscow and across Russia, shift in the political and defense and economic landscape that we've seen through the 2010s, as that landscape is matched to strategic planning. One of the examples of this would be, for instance, the establishment of situation and rejuvenation of situation centers, particularly the National Defense Management Center, which again we look at in some depth in the book. It also helps us to understand dysfunction, because really in many ways what we're looking at is how the plans are then implemented. Without implementation or the effort to implement, we don't have a sense of strategy. And here this allows us to open up the question of how Moscow seeks to conduct the orchestra. As Lawrence Friedman, one of the leading strategists of thinkers about strategy, has pointed out, there is the problem with strategy is other people, both on our own side and elsewhere. So it's a question of conducting the orchestra. And again, this is one of the questions that the book delves into, how the Russian leadership seeks to build in and generate support and then ensure that decisions are implemented. So strategy here is really a tool for trying to dig into the question of how Russia works on the one hand, but also how it doesn't work. It's a tool to take us beyond the abstract. Who is in charge of what? How does the chain of command work? And again, this helps us to understand the pressure that the Russian leadership has brought on making the system work through the 2010s, increasing pressure to fulfill tasks. And we can build further on this to understand how the organizations or institutions that are in place, such as the Security Council, play a role in this, but also other organizations, other companies perhaps also, such as Rosneft and Rosatom and like companies, are both investors in Russian strategy, but also implementers of it. So Russian strategy in that sense is that, again, as I say, that tool for understanding how Russia does and doesn't work. And it helps us to explain some of the dysfunctionality, some of the problems that the leadership has faced, whether it's in economics or energy, including also in military. Sometimes I use the metaphor of a lighthouse, for instance, when discussing Russian strategy, which is when Moscow organizes its capabilities, administrative, political, and financial, the beam can be very strong. But the bandwidth is quite limited, and the light has to move further forward and to deal with other questions. So once one particular issue is resolved or addressed, then the light begins to move on to trying to deal with another one. And once it moves further around, the original question is left in the dark. So through the lens of strategy, we can understand the problems of how the leadership has struggled sometimes to implement strategy. And third, really what the book seeks to delve into is a sense of mental maps. And mental maps is one of those interesting questions like strategy and like the policy debate, which is a very contentious one because it involves subjectivity and how others view the world. But once we start to dig into how Moscow sees the world and divides it up, we start to see all sorts of other questions emerge from this. The representations of geopolitical space, for instance, connectivity between regions, interconnectivity between international regions as well. And the book, for instance, looks into the Northern Sea route as a means of linking and connecting the Euro-Atlantic world with the Asia-Pacific world, as Moscow continues to call it, but also building infrastructure to connect the High North and the Indian Ocean. So again, we're talking about drawing us into the questions of energy and economics and longer term infrastructure plans that seek to link the world, also the diversification of Russian thinking, economic and energy, about developing a diversified economic approach to international affairs where Russia is becoming a strategic, or has become a strategic supplier of strategic goods to a wide range of countries, both in the Asia-Pacific region, but also further in what we might consider the global south. So the book therefore seeks us to place us in this longer term picture, where we see the current war as part of this bigger picture, and trying to place us in sense of of strategy and whether Russia has a long game. I think it positions us better to think about Russia in these terms, the explicit efforts that the Russian leadership have made to turn Russia into a ubiquitous power, an indispensable power in many ways, but it also points us towards this sense of Russia, the Russian leadership building and preparing for a 2020s of competition. And this is where we must also contextualize today's events. We see current discussion in the Russian leadership and in some of their thinkers about this being the first battle of this 2020s of competition. So I'll draw my initial remarks to a close there. I'm interested in your questions. Again, as I say, the book is, as Will says, the book is available with a hefty discount. It's out this month, and thank you very much, Will, again for the opportunity both to be a fellow here and to present the book.
Thank you very much, Andrew. A reminder that if you do have questions, you can email them to us at kennan@wilsoncenter.org. You can send it to our Twitter account at Kennan Institute or right on our Facebook page. I want to begin by talking about this idea of competition, and not only geopolitical competition, but geoeconomic competition, because there are many impressions of the Russian economy, but one does not really come to the conclusion that it is a diverse economy or that is really a competitive economy. And I think this has been confirmed in the light of the sanctions that have been placed. We still, the opinion is still out whether they are working or not, or how fast they will work. But why would Russia want to kind of stake its claim in the 2020s as a geo-economic power? That I find very surprising in light of all the economic issues and problems that Russia faces. So if you could just explain a little bit more about why Russia feels that it has to compete, and whether it is really in a position to compete on a global scale economically.
Sure. Yes, thank you, Will. This is one of the most interesting things that came from the research in the book. Again, that sense of competition was not so much that initially that Russia felt it could compete, but was one of the driving animations of Russian strategic thought in the 2000s and early 2010s. That yes, the economy was not diverse and not very competitive, but actually the answer therefore has come to a degree of attempting to seek diversification away from the Euro-Atlantic community. So building relations with a wide range of states across the international environment, particularly as we often talk about China, but also Indonesia, India, Bangladesh, Turkey, and so on. There are Egypt. There are many others where the Russian leadership has since the 2000s sought to go beyond the Euro-Atlantic community to become competitors in developing economies. But the real core to your question, I think, lies in energy, and that's where the Russian leadership has in some ways retreated, what you might say, to strategic heights of basing an economy on the value of hydrocarbons, and particularly through liquefied natural gas, to remain one of the top 3 leading suppliers of hydrocarbons to the world. So this is why we see the emphasis on development in the high north, development of the Northern Sea Route, and not just oil and gas, but LNG there as well. So again, it's that point about competition over what could be and striking at the heart of Russian economic capability, an undiversified economy in many ways, and one reliant on energy. And when you start to read through, for instance, the energy documents, but also some of the others, it immediately becomes clear that actually the sense of US challenge to Russian traditional energy markets, particularly in Europe, is seen as a potential challenge to the budget, and therefore seen as an issue of national security. So geoeconomics becomes merged increasingly with national security issues. So the competition is something that is in Moscow's view was being imposed on them through the 2010s. And as a result, they have sought to diversify beyond the Western world, what Lavrov would have called the post-West world. That's where we get this sense of geoeconomic competition from. And I think it underpins a lot of the activity towards trying to build and position Russia as a supplier of strategically important goods to states, so hydrocarbons, grain, weapons, and so on.
Thank you. So we're beginning to get some questions in. The first question is from James Hutchinson, and he asks, what key indicators within the Arctic region would analysts look out for regarding Russia's actions in the region, and what do these variables represent for Russian strategic objectives?
Well, the first thing to answer to this is the way that the Russian leadership has shaped a net of strategic documents about how they envisage the development of the Arctic through to, again, updated through to 2030 and 2035. This gives us an indication that actually the Arctic has been one of the key priorities for Moscow, again, since the mid 2000s and early 2010s. These documents give some insight into the kinds of priorities there and the shift that has undergone, the shift that's been underway in terms of Russian planning away from cooperation more towards competition. I think what we'd want to do is to look at the role not just of companies such as Rosneft, but also Novatek and Rosatom in how those organizations or companies are being used to develop the Northern Sea route, but also the legislation that tries to turn the Northern Sea route into an internal waterway. I think these are going to be the core parts of the answer to that question. There's a full chapter on this. We talk about in the book about Russia as a polar power, and we try to categorize that. Obviously, in many ways, Russia is an Arctic power, being right there, it's very explicit, but also linking Russia to Antarctica also. So I think this is something that we'd want to look into a bit more about Russia and Antarctica, but there's a full chapter in the book on Russia and the Arctic.
Thank you very much. Again, if you have questions for today's speaker, you can send them via email to kennan@wilsoncenter.org, to our Twitter account @Kennan Institute, or right on our Facebook page. The next question comes from Jeffrey James, and he asks, please explain how the West can build a successful defense in the face of nuclear weapons threats from Russia.
Well, the answer to that, first of all, is to have a better understanding of the Russian escalation ladder and Russian military strategy, to have clarity about where nuclear weapons fit into Russian strategy, military strategy. It's become a little bit of a guessing game, and certain lines like escalate to de-escalate and so on feature in the discussion. But actually, once we start to investigate the Russian escalatory ladder, which is depending on whether you look at Kokoschin's book and work, or whether you look at some of the other works, there's an escalatory ladder of about 18 rungs, and the nuclear weapons tend to come in at around 14. It also is a part of a specific kind of war. So oddly enough, not the kind of war we currently see underway in Ukraine, which might be described in Russian military strategic terms as a local war, but actually more in terms of the regional war and large-scale war. So the first thing to do actually is to have much better clarity on diagnosing Russian way in war. I think this is an essential question which we struggled with through the 2010s, partly because we diagnosed Russian measures short of war. And we lost the point for building through the modernization of Russian nuclear capabilities, Russian armed forces, and so on. And we didn't really examine, with some honorable exceptions, Russian military strategy and where nuclear fits in. So that's the first real step that we have to go into on that. The second is to start thinking more actively about deterrence. And whether one likes it or not, deterrence is actually a dialogue with one's counterpart and adversary. So establishing a communication network that allows you to explore deterrence through punishment. That's how we would go about doing that.
Thanks. Our next question comes from Irina Vachinkina, and she asks, what is Dr. Monaghan's perspective on Russia's current strategy in Asia, and more specifically, its relations and geostrategic position to China? That's a big question.
Yes, can we have a whole other session on that? Well, I think this is a really good question. It's a question of strategic import. I mean, when we look specifically at China, we see the effort that the Russian leadership has made over really over 20 years or so, since quite early in the Putin era, so to speak. Russia has a very long border, of course, with China. It's had a fractious and difficult relationship with China in the past, but the effort that has been made to try to resolve some of those issues. And then, so we start to see through into the 2010s and late into that last decade, we had much more effusive language between Russia and China, much more positive relations across economic and military and indeed diplomatic aspects. And when you see the joint statement in February before the war began of no limits to the relationship, this gives you an indication of where Russia was was driving this. It is worth bearing in mind that as we talk about in the book, and some of the scenarios that Russia has, one of those is that there is a bipolar world run essentially by the US and China, and where Russia fits in on that is an interesting question. But I think more and more we see Russia and China working together on that field. So it's a more nuanced relationship than perhaps the word ally or partnership gives credit for. But I think it's a full priority for Russian strategic agenda over the last decade. Again, building those energy relationships, building economic relationships. China will soon probably become Russia will become a strategic supplier of all five goods, strategically important goods to China in the not too distant future. It's not, of course, just China. I emphasized in my remarks, we also look at Indonesia and other states in the region. But so we are looking at that broader Asia-Pacific region, as Moscow continues to call it, and reaching into states also such as Bangladesh. But China, I think we can say, is one of the important linchpins here, yes.
Andrew, you mentioned the strategic interests of Russia in China, but does China reciprocate, as it were? I know we have this whole no limits pronouncement, but one has always been perceived that there was an imbalance, especially in terms of economic power, between Russia and China. And so does China share the same predilections or aspirations as Russia? Or is Russia, as is often described, the junior partner?
A good question, Will, that I have to say you'd need to ask a sinologist about that. The book I've written is on Russian capacity. I don't want to sound too overly focused, but I would have to pass that to a sinologist. I'm not sure that Moscow necessarily sees it in the terms of junior, senior partners. I think Russia sees the current century as being a Pacific century, the 21st century as a Pacific century. Very few people, I'm sure, in Moscow, in strategic circles, think that China is going to be anything other than a major player, if not the major player in the not too distant future. And that's why I think such effort is being made to build the relationship. But as for the Chinese view, all I can do is quote the joint statements which to it and refer to it as partnership, and sometimes there's blurring around the word of ally and no limits being a useful point as a joint statement.
Our next question asks, has Russia identified the obstacles to achieving their strategy? Demographics, lack of infrastructure, etc.
Yes, excellent question. And the answer to that is yes. And it's not specifically the subject of this book. This book is in some senses, informally a volume 2 of a project and a book I wrote in 2017 called Power in Modern Russia. The Russian leadership started with all sorts of difficulties, inheritance difficulties from the Soviet Union about a disjointed economy, one industry towns, decrepit and aging infrastructure, limits on infrastructure, roads and rail and air and canal connections being very poorly framed. Also problems with the armed forces, of course. So a wide range of problems. And if one was to think in strategic terms, you wouldn't want to start from where Moscow started in 2000. at the other parts to this and where they also have identified obstacles. It's not just a good points. I agree with you that the demography and infrastructure and so on are certainly obstacles, but perhaps the most important obstacle that the Russian leadership has recognized and sought to deal with over the last 15 to 20 years is the problem of the dysfunction in the chain of command. So as I was saying, that question of conducting the orchestra of the state, where you try to make ministries, departments, agencies, and other actors, companies perform harmoniously. And this is where, of course, all strategists face difficulties, because everyone has veto arguments and other empire building questions and so on. So, and the Russian leadership is well aware of this and has tried to resolve it through various mechanisms, through creating different kinds of meetings, through trying to strengthen the vertical of power, through bringing in other people, by promoting, for instance, people like Mishustin to prime minister. Of course, this is an imperfect response. And many of these problems remain. So again, that question is an excellent one, because it's really about implementation, not just formulating plans, which is already difficult, but then implementing them. And we often find that actually instructions are either tardily or even not at all implemented.
Our next question comes from Megan Dixon, and she asks, how do we transform an overly respectful geopolitical approach to Russia into one that deals explicitly with kleptocracy? Also, given that the Russian petroleum industry cannot actually function without foreign inputs, question disappeared. How can they possibly continue that sole aspect that runs their economy and expect to be competitive?
Well, that's two sets of important questions about Russian leadership as a kleptocracy. I'm sure you'll be familiar with the books that have been written on that. Karen Dawisha wrote a book on it. This is trying to look really as a Russia. This book is trying to look much more as Russia as a state leadership that's trying to shape a national agenda, and that's really the approach that the book is taking in terms of how they set out a series of national priorities. And even those, frankly, are things that our leadership in the UK, in the US, in NATO needs to take rather more seriously. As I mentioned, and the book goes into it in some detail, how the Russian leadership has been explicit in its views about how it not only disagrees with much of what the Atlantic world has been saying, but how it wants to try to compete with it. So the answer, which is slightly more to the trajectory of this book, rather than a kleptocracy, is to actually have a greater familiarity with Russia's strategic agenda. And when one has that familiarity, there's a certain sense of surprise mitigation, because often the agenda is stated relatively explicitly. The question is less, therefore, about what are the priorities and how much of that agenda can they implement. And look, as the question about Russian energy goes, at the moment, we still see sanctions being limited, frankly, to allow for sales to Europe and sales of oil and gas to go to Europe. But also there's that sense of where we set up relations, how we understand the economic relationship, the energy relationship between Russia and China, Russia and India, Russia and Indonesia, and so on. So I'm not sure that the question of Russian energy yet is quite so bust for them.
Okay, our next question comes from Alex Shikov. Andrew mentioned that we ought to rethink Cold War and think freshly about our competition with Russia. However, Russia, despite the talk of geo-economic tools, went for an age-old conquest of Ukraine in the 21st century. So the question then is, shouldn't we do the same and analyze Russia from a historical perspective and draw our predictions from history rather than Russian official statements?
Well, there's two answers to that. First of all, as a background as a historian, I'm always tempted to say that one should use history. and think through how this influences the current environment. Thinking through history, of course, is not about using analogies and quite simplistic references back to the Cold War or back to the 1930s. History is thinking about cause and effect, consequence and change. That's why actually studying history is a perfectly valid way of understanding strategy also. There's great value to be had in this. I think when one looks at age-old conquest, what we actually mean really in terms of when we look at the book and what's happening now is that we understand that the Russian leadership uses war as a tool of policy. That's a historical question, it's a historical approach, but war changes. War changes everything. There's no such thing as two wars being the same, as the Russians say. So we have to look into what we would talk as the changing character of war. So even if we start to think through age-old conquest terms, in order to get this right, in order to understand where the Russian leadership is attempting to go, we still have to be looking to the future, not to the past. Of course, looking to the future does not mean that we start essentially our thinking from today and then we look ahead to tomorrow. In fact, actually, when you read the Russian documents without history, without being informed by history, you won't be able to interpret them. The military doctrine and the documents by Gerasimov are a very good example of that, where people who were not historically informed and not aware of Russian military history and state history were unable to interpret the documents effectively, and the references and the implicit quotes and so on. So I agree with the premise of the question, which is history is all important, but you do have to look at the strategic planning documents in order to understand the priorities and where the Russian leadership thinks it's taking that state, which is to 2030, not back to Tsarist imperial era or the Soviet Union.
Our next question comes from Ann Phillips. How do the South Caucasus and Central Asia fit into Russia's grand strategy?
Well, it's another very good question, because the former, what we would call probably unhappily the former Soviet space, and more realistically and usefully the Eurasian space, is the Russian primary priority in foreign policy international terms. So of course we're talking about concern in Moscow about instability in both South Caucasus and Central Asia. So this region features quite prominently in that. What I would say is that this is a number one priority for the Russian leadership, that it dominates Eurasia, but at the same time, by dominating Eurasia, the Russian leadership then seeks to have a global and, as I say, ubiquitous approach to international affairs. So things being interconnected, regions being interconnected with this bigger global picture. So very important in Russian priorities as part of a global approach.
Okay, our next question asks, do you think that Russia's grand plans that you described will be derailed by the war with Ukraine, where it seems Putin made severe military miscalculations and the economic sanctions could cripple the economy and perhaps topple the regime?
Certainly, we have seen plenty of examples in the past of bad decisions being taken that undermines and derails a grand strategy. We've seen examples also of decisions, even recently by the Russian leadership, taking decisions, for instance, to annex Crimea that impinged on their own grand strategy in the mid-2010s. The decision to annex Crimea and support the situation in Donbass and Luhansk resulted in the cutoff of economic relations with the United States, which was stated in the May decrees as a priority. It also undermined and delayed defense modernization. So I would say that there are certainly ramifications for Russian grand strategy that are very serious with the current situation. The war has resulted in a number of, I suspect, I think, surprising developments for the Russian leadership, the scale and the speed of the sanctions that were imposed on Russia. I would be a bit cautious to say that the grand strategy as a whole has been fully derailed. Part of the attempt the book looks into this longer term trajectory and a bump in the road, a very serious bump though this is in the longer term horizon, is is an obstacle to grand strategy rather than it derailing it. And I think actually the war is an indication of this bigger picture grand strategy that the Russian leadership has seen, which is a shift in international affairs, a shift in the structure of the international order, and so a whole range of strategic questions are now open. But we still have to understand the basis of Russian grand strategy, which is this attempt to diversify away from the West, this attempt to secure its primacy in Eurasia, and its attempt to shape and position itself for this 2020s of competition. So long anticipated, I think we must say. So it's not a black swan, so to speak. It's not a surprise, an unpredictable, highly unlikely event that has emerged here. The war, I think, for much of the Russian leadership is what we would call a grey rhino, a highly likely event with strategic impact. And I think that's why we must look at strategy.
So our next question asks, oops, and we've already lost that. When you speak of Russian leadership, who do you mean? Putin plus the military, parliament? And are there any rifts, splits in opinion within the leadership, or is this simply not tolerated? How has this changed since the war began in Ukraine?
Well, I am, of course, specifically using the term Russian leadership, yes, rather than Putin. When it comes to it, what we should be looking at, I think, is what's long been called the collective Putin, because there's a group of people there. When we go back to the 1999, 2000, and Putin is asked who are your close advisors, who are your friends, to whom do you turn? He names Nikolai Patrushev, Sergei Ivanov, Dmitry Medvedev, Alexei Kudrin, all of whom are there or thereabouts. The first three, of course, still in quite senior positions. So there's a certain sense of continuity in the Russian leadership over this long-term period. And yes, then beyond this immediate group, we then have, of course, the heads of different organizations, different ministries, whether it's the head of the FSB or whether it's the head of the SVR, the head of parliament, Volodin. All of this does, yes, feature into what I would consider to be the Russian leadership. More broadly, looking at questions of rifts and splits, once you start to draw it out more broadly, you're always going to have some sense of disagreement. And I think that is, I think that's understandable, because it's all sorts of different interests are being represented in that leadership. But I think what we're looking at the moment is a sense of consensus. In fact, there's quite a long time been now a consensus amongst the Russian leadership, across the Russian leadership, about the trajectory in international affairs. That foresight that I was talking about really was a question of consensus across the policy elite, broadly written. And indeed, over the last 2 to 3 years, you've seen explicit statements by the leadership and many senior thinkers saying we're being proved right by events. Now, that's a Russian view, not necessarily one that those outside the state would share. But I think at the moment we look at consensus, and very few people have from the government machinery, senior government machinery, have left their positions or left the country. So I think we still look at this broader leadership across the Russian policy landscape.
A brief follow-up question from Jan Menz. Do you think anyone in the chain of command would disobey Putin? For example, if he wanted to use nuclear weapons, or is this consensus that you described pretty firm?
Well, I think, look, the nuclear question is an important one, and it's a very high-end question. We're talking right at the top of the escalatory ladder. There are mechanisms within Russia. It takes us back to the early question about success and deterring Russia from nuclear use. It really demands of us the sense of a better understanding of how the nuclear decision is made. But I think at the moment we're looking at consensus. I would stay a little bit further away from the nuclear aspect of this, the weapons of mass destruction aspect, but say that that we are looking in warfighting terms, we are looking at a broader consensus, yes.
So the next question asks, can you talk about cyber war as a new kind of strategy from Russia?
To an extent, yes. It's not one of the themes that we cover in the book, I must say. There are a couple of subjects that we would like to start thinking about in another project. One of which is Russian diplomacy, for instance, which I think is often underestimated, but also Russian cyber. And here the question is, where does cyber fit into the chain of command? And what we've tended to see is that actually I think we overplayed the cyber question through the 2010s. It's clearly part of the Russian discussion, part of the Russian strategic approach, but we would then want to try to link that into the, as I said earlier, the chain of command. This is a tool of policy, not a cyber strategy so much. And then we start to look more into information policy, information security. So really we'd have to shift the question from cyber itself to the question of how information strategy is set out.
Our next question comes from John Lawrence, and he asks, in your view, has Russia decided for its own economic or other reasons to use military means to disrupt the post-1945 rules-based international system and to force economic deglobalization and the division of the world into competing political and economic blocs?
Number of different answers to this, again, rather vast question. I think we certainly see the Russian military, being aligned over the last decade with some of Russia's economic interests. So we see the military being aligned to interests in the Arctic. We see investment in the Russian Navy and so on, because a lot of Russian trade exports go by sea. But when it comes to the use of force, I think this is a view of how the world works together. So again, the use of force is part of a tool of strategic policy. And I think that here we do start to link the question of influence in the Black Sea region, but also the influence of the Atlantic community, as the Russian leadership points out, as part of the reason for going to war. So the military tool is brought into that, yes. And then we start to say, well, okay, the Russian leadership, again, has long talked about this shift away from the Atlantic world, and we're moving now beyond the post-World War II arrangements. And this, again, that's that part of this shift towards building a new architecture. So yes, I think, if we're going to adopt the Russian view explicitly, we have to understand this as being the first battle for the new order. This is what makes it so strategically important. It comes back to a number of the other questions. This is what the Russian leadership has been talking about in many ways, and planning for, and so on. And again, decisions can be made that undermine strategy or cause problems for it, and so on. But this is the bigger picture in which the Russian leadership, I think, approaches international affairs. Yes.
Another question. I know you talked about Crimea before, but this is from Olivia Brinich, and she asks, how does Crimea fit into Russia's grand strategy? More specifically, how has Putin's control of Crimea shifted the Kremlin's military capabilities?
Well, I mean, two relatively straightforward answers to that in my view. First of all, it provides strengthening to the southern strategic direction on the one hand, but also it provides domination of the Black Sea. And where you have therefore exports going out through the Black Sea out into the Eastern Mediterranean and beyond. So again, it links that sense of it provides a stronger base and position in the Black Sea from which to start to project power into that region and beyond into the Eastern Mediterranean.
The next question, how much is the Kremlin's grand strategy inspired by Western geopoliticians, including Brzezinski and other major geopolitical thinkers?
It's a really good question, because of course the Russian leadership hasn't tended until quite recently to be geo-economically focused. I think that grand strategy, though, in some senses is not really, the Russian grand strategy is not substantively influenced by Brzezinski. It's much more focused on, as I say, this sense of how the Russian leadership has sought to do foresight and measures through what the horizon is, what is the changing world. And in this sense, the Russian leadership does it differently to the Atlantic community. So it looks at the trajectory of world affairs, international affairs, it looks at economics, it looks at security and politics. And so it's much more focused on that foresight question than on Western geopoliticians. It's worth mentioning here, though, that some Western foresight experts are quite popular also in Russia. So there is some Western influence in how the Russian leadership does foresight too.
You've talked about Russia's desire to compete globally, but you've also talked about the power vertical and the highly centralized nature of this economy. Again, when we think about having a competitive economy, we don't necessarily think about a few giant state companies who obviously perform the majority of the economic, is responsible for the majority of the economic growth. So to what extent does this highly centralized economy, do you think, can it compete globally into the future?
Okay, yes, good questions. Again, when we talk about competing globally, this sense of global presence is I think really important to understand this, and we do explore this in some depth in the book. You'll note I've not really used great power in other states like this, but the agenda is twofold. One is to position Russia as a ubiquitous power with interests across the world. The other is to talk about Russia as position Russia as an indispensable player in every essential question. That's really what we mean by competing globally. But the power vertical and centralized command doesn't limit it to doesn't limit Russian activity to a narrow geographical space. Quite the contrary. When you start to see, for instance, let's just take Rosneft activity, and you find a good example, or Rosatom activity, a good example of how state companies and similar other organizations, like organizations, are deployed across the world to compete indeed with other state companies. And indeed, Rosneft has done that reasonably well, for instance, in establishing itself in India and Indonesia and elsewhere across the world. So I don't think that the power vertical and centralized command prohibits Russia's ability to deploy its companies across the world. And again, we go into this in much more detail in the book. So hopefully that gives a first answer that you want to explore. But essentially, Rosatom, Novatek, Rosneft, and these organizations, these companies, and others alike are an essential feature of this ubiquitous, an attempt to be ubiquitous.
We have a lot of questions, more questions about China, and I'm not going to ask them because you obviously have decided that you're not a China expert, and I won't demand that you become one in the last minutes of your talk. So I think we've kind of gone over the various types of challenges that exist for Russian grand strategy. Do you think that in light of a broad global strategy, that it is feasible in the timetable that you've identified, kind of the 2020s and 2030s? Or is this, like the national project, something that are going to just drag on and on and on, where there's no real kind of sense of accomplishment or achievement, but simply remain aspirational for the long term?
Look, I mean, to an extent, all of this remains aspirational, because what we're talking about is Russian politics, and we're talking about Russian, therefore, political culture, and some of the strategic agenda is very aspirational. Indeed, it's explicitly stated as being aspirational in some senses. So that, again, I return to that point. The strategy here is a tool for opening this up and to reduce and to mitigate the effects of surprise. So really what we're seeking to do is to say, these are the stated priorities. This is what the Russian leadership has explicitly stated it's going to try to do. And then we match that against the extent to which it's been able to implement it. And I think that it's a really interesting question. Is it feasible in the timetable or isn't it? Well, let's take a look at the Russia's positioning based on this grand strategy, what the Russian leadership has been able to do. If we take the decade between 2007 and 2017, we see a major shift in Russian position in the world because of the attempt to implement grand strategy, where Russia, many of the flaws across Russia, domestically and internationally, in its international activity, were visible. It's the limits on what it was able to do were much more significant at the end of the 2000s and in the early 2010s compared to what it was able to do later that decade. So is it feasible in the timetable? Considerable success was achieved, and we talk through some of that in the book in that timetable, but success is always mitigated and balanced against the flaws of non-implementation, of neglect and laziness, of negligence and other things that we haven't really talked about in this session, whether it's corruption or whether it's a simple lack of implementation of orders. So is it feasible? The answer is yes. Is it always, in many ways it has been. Feasible doesn't mean 100% implementation. It means sometimes 50, sometimes 70%, sometimes 35%. And that's our measure for understanding how Russia does and doesn't work. Of course it will drag on. Of course it will drag on and roll on. And of course there'll be numerous aspects of this that are of the strategic agenda that are not implemented and will simply be restated. And this is part of that broader question of how we can use strategy to distinguish what is distinctively Russian and what is much more, let's call it, structural questions that are similar to others. So in many ways, using the strategic tool here to understand Russian activity, we are trying to make it a little more familiar, because those who try strategy understand that departments don't necessarily coordinate, ministries don't necessarily coordinate. It gives us the tools to explore the problems within the Russian system also. So it's not just about achieving aspirational ends, it's about really being a tool to understand, as I say, this sense of how Russia works, how it does not work.
I'm going to bring this conversation to a close, but I just want to ask one more question, and that is, what does the West not understand in taking into account Russian strategy? I'm a historian by training. Obviously, you've talked about kind of following historical trends and models and so forth, but in terms of what we don't understand about Russia, what is the main ingredient in this grand strategy that simply the West doesn't appreciate or understand?
Wow, what a question on which to thank you, Will. I don't think we understand the chain of command very well. I think we tend to put Russia into the abstract. I'm going to cheat slightly by offering two things. We don't understand the chain of command very well. Therefore, we don't really understand the formulation of plans and their implementation. I often hear questions, for instance, the Kremlin or Putin's Russia or some such. We don't come to grips with who is appointed to do what and why it might be so. And that for me is the thing that we don't understand. Often because we don't look. What we haven't understood about Russia over the last decade is Russian strategic planning and how the leadership has attempted to do this. And we haven't looked into it in order to explore both its functional problems as well as its conceptual problems. So for me, that we almost entirely overlook grand strategy, because the great majority, as I sort of lay out here, great majority of policymakers and observers said that Russian is just, the leadership is just ad hoc making it up as it goes along. Except this is demonstrably not true, and it's very important for us to understand now what strategy is for. Strategy is going to be about how Russia regenerates from this. And we can use our history, well, I mean, to understand, yes, the problems with that, but actually regeneration and longer term context for this is very revealing, that we tend to focus on the here and now. And I think actually our horizon really must now be to 2030 and 2035. So we don't understand chain of command and we don't really understand trajectory. That's what we've got wrong over the last decade.
Well, on that note, thank you very much, Andrew, for this enlightening talk. I do want to remind our audience that you can receive a 25% discount on the purchase of Dr. Monaghan's book on the Manchester University Press website. And I'll repeat the code as well, OTH882. Anyway, thank you very much, Andrew, for just this excellent talk. And I thank all the questioners. And we look forward to you coming in to expand on your research and talk to us soon. Thanks very much, Andrew.
Thanks, Will. Bye-bye. Thank you all for the questions.